All right. Good morning, everybody. We're probably a minute or so early here. I just wanted to make sure that I was connected, and we'll go ahead and kind of start slow here this morning, and hopefully a few more people will be able to join us as we get going. So welcome to our next episode of Ask the Agronomist. We're kind of back to normal now, so it's just me and Adam. We're back at Nutrient and Macomb. No fancy famous guest host today. Just Lance. So sorry about that, and we'll get through it. We've got a lot of stuff I want to talk about this morning relative to planting date and soil conditions and weather conditions, and we're going to talk a little bit about taking out cover crops and burn down applications. I wanted to start out with a shout out to my Fulton County brethren that are recovering from the tornadoes that went through Tuesday night. I think that was Adam. Is that right? Yeah, Tuesday night. Had a pretty bad storm event went through kind of south central Fulton County Tuesday night. Actually started roughly on the McDonough County line in the Table Grove area, impacted Table Grove, Ipava, Lewistown, and Bryant. Kind of ended in kind of that northeast of Lewistown area. I know the last town that was significantly impacted was Bryant. I'm not sure how much damage there was out in the countryside east of Bryant. Bryant kind of got the brunt of it. Lewistown had a glancing blow, so anything on the north edge of Lewistown, it's got some damage. And a lot of farmsteads tore up, a lot of machine sheds gone, a lot of grain bins gone, in places, a lot of houses gone, and a lot of houses definitely damaged. So I haven't heard details. I don't know how big it was. I don't know how strong it was. But if you travel on Highway 97, which don't go be a gawker because they got lots of work to do to get things put back together there. But north of Lewistown on Highway 97, where it crossed the road, you could see just by how the ground was scoured. If you've ever been where a tornado traveled, you can kind of tell when they're on the ground by the way things look, and it was pretty big and it was pretty wide and it was on the ground, and any house or barn or bin that was anywhere near the path of that is somewhere between severely damaged and gone. So thoughts and prayers going out to those folks that are dealing with that. Thankfully, as far as I know, there were no fatalities. I did hear there was, and this is second or third hand, so don't know the details of this. There was one individual that was injured that was pretty severely injured, but hopefully they recover from their injuries. And when you look at the way things look over there, especially in Bryant, it's pretty amazing that there wasn't anybody killed. So hopefully those who were injured are able to recover from their injuries. Hopefully those that lost property were well insured. As you know, it costs a fortune to put things back these days. So if you were impacted by that, hopefully you were well covered. And those of us who were not impacted by that are both thankful we were not impacted, and feel a little bit guilty because other people are going through some pretty tough times. But anyway, that happens, unfortunately. Farm people, rural people in general, are extremely resilient. They band together when bad things happen. So I'm sure there's a lot of neighbors pitching in and helping out. I know Farm Bureau's been out delivering meals. It was pretty impressive at the Lewiston High School. Is kind of the staging area for all the power companies and utility companies that are there, and the storm chasers are out in force. And when I was through there late yesterday afternoon, which would have been just almost exactly 24 hours after the tornado went through, there were probably between 50 and 100 power company utility trucks staging there in the Lewiston High School parking lot. There were 3 semi loads of brand new big telephone poles sitting out on the highway, and the trucks and the equipment and the people were just pouring in from 4 directions there, mobilizing to get things put back together. So shout out to those guys as well. that do that. So anyway, we'll get into the agronomy. I got speaking of that, I got a little feedback, Adam. I'll share this with you live here on the air. We were with Tom Eichhoff 2 weeks ago. We had Tom on as a guest host, and Tom's an awesome guy. I've known Tom for a long time. I was very excited to have Tom on Ask the Agronomist, and I personally thought that was one of our best episodes that we'd ever had with Tom. Now, I got some feedback from a viewer that he turned it on, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, it was still Tom and I chit-chatting and kind of talking about things that didn't have anything to do with agronomy. And for his taste, it was a little too much, these two guys talking and not enough agronomy. So apparently Tom and I reminiscing about things and getting caught up about things wasn't as entertaining for some of our viewers as it was for me. So good reminder to the agronomist to stick to agronomy content, perhaps for Ask the Agronomist. But anyway, thanks to Tom for joining with me. I really love that episode. And if you're thinking as you're watching it that there's no agronomy, we do get to the agronomy at some point. So stick with it. I think you'll enjoy it. I also neglected to call out last week or last episode that my next interview that we're doing, called The Agronomist Asks, was with a colleague of mine named Brad Miller. Brad is a TA from Ohio, and so that episode has been posted. And our next one, which will come out a week from now, is with a guy who's not a TA, who's not an agronomist, who actually argued with me that he should not be interviewed by me as part of the Agronomist Asked, but actually I strongly disagreed with him, and I thought it was a good interview. So Nick Weber, who works in our knowledge transfer group, and Nick is actually a digital communications guy, so he's really involved with how we get agronomic information out to customers. So I work with Nick on doing stuff here on YouTube Live. His assistant Lonnie is actually who helped video those interviews, and Nick helps a lot of people like me that are trying to figure out how to reach people, and he does a lot of work internally within Bayer to make sure that our technical information is accessible online to people that want to consume information in some way differently than calling their agronomist or calling their FSR. So that's the next episode of The Agronomist Asks, and that will drop probably next Thursday. Typically, we're releasing those in the off week between the live episodes, so look for that next week. So we'll jump into things here, and I know Adam and I were talking yesterday, and Adam was sharing with me a lot of the questions he's been getting from growers. I've been having a lot of conversations with dealers and growers. I know all of our FSRs and all of our dealers have about, when should I start planting? People already have. Which crop should I be planting? Should I be planting both? How aggressively should I be planting? How do you know when to start planting? And so I just made a list, just a quick list here of, how do you determine when you're going to start planting on your farm? So soil conditions is probably the one I hear most often. And I actually had an interesting conversation with one of my more analytical FSRs a couple days ago about what's the appropriate way to do a ribbon test to determine whether your soil moisture is right, because they were asking, very specifically, well, how hard do you squeeze it? How hard do you try to ball that mud together? If you use a light touch, it'll fall apart even if it's pretty wet. If you use a heavier touch, you can turn it into a mud ball. What's the appropriate method for that? And I'll be honest with you, I've never been taught the appropriate method for doing a ribbon test. I grew up on a farm that's got some red clay that, you could ribbon that stuff in August, probably. It's one kiln away from being a brick. So the soil type is going to vary, how that soil feels to you, how it works, how wet you can get away with being on it. And that's the beautiful thing about soil organic matter. It covers up a lot of sins. And if you're blessed with a dark, high organic matter prairie soil, you can do dumb things and the soil is going to be fine. If you're on a light timber soil or a clay soil, that's not the case. They're not so forgiving. So that soil conditions one, I think is important. And I would say as a general rule, if you're doing anything in a field and not making any dust, it's probably too wet. So keep an eye on soil conditions. That'd be number one. Adam and I were joking yesterday. It's a little surprising to me how frequently I get asked, what's the soil temperature? Or have you seen the soil temperature? Or where do I find soil temperature? Or is there a website I can go to look up soil temperature? And there are numerous places online where you can get into climate networks, and almost every climate network that has a weather station, there's going to be a soil probe attached to that weather station. Now it might be bare ground, it might be inside, it might be at 2 inches, it might be at 4 inches. You need to kind of pay attention to what it is, and no weather station soil probe is going to perfectly mimic the conditions in your field. And if it's a tilled soil versus a no-till soil versus a cover crop covered soil versus a light soil or a dark soil, it dramatically changes, the temperature. Now, the reason I joke that I'm surprised how many people ask about soil temperature, it doesn't appear to me that very many people pay much attention to soil temperature when it comes to planting. And we're more concerned with soil conditions, maybe the weather forecast, other factors, rather than soil temperature. But I did the most recent soil temp map I saw. There really wasn't any soil that was above 50 degrees, except for pretty far southern Illinois, where it's been too wet to plant. So the old rule that you need to have 50-degree soils to plant, that was really never the rule. What the old textbooks would say is optimal plant growth does not occur until you reach 50 degrees or warmer soil temperatures. It doesn't mean that things don't grow below 50. They absolutely do. Corn actually will grow in soils in the low 40s, but it just grows terribly, terribly, terribly slow. And if you want your corn to be up in less than 3 weeks, you're going to have 50 plus degree soil temperatures to get that 110 to 125 heat units accumulated, which is what it's going to take to get that corn out of the ground. Now, another question I get related to that frequently is, well, is that air temperature heat units or is that soil temperature heat units? Because, sometimes the way the formula calculates heat units, air temperature is going to generate a lot more heat units than soil temperature does. Well, I don't honestly know how many heat units that plant is experiencing in the soil, but when we talk about that 110 to 120 heat units to get corn emerged out of the ground, that is air temperature heat unit based. So that seedling corn plant is not going to experience probably 110 heat units, but 110-ish air temperature heat units is about what it's typically going to take to get corn, germinated and emerged out of the soil. Varies a little bit by hybrid, probably varies a little bit too in what there's probably a normal difference between air and soil temp. And if you have situations where you've got warm air temps and cooler soil temps, it may appear to take more than 110 heat units to get that corn out of the ground, because what the corn is experiencing is the soil temperature, not the air temperature. But there is a correlation between soil temp and air temp. So we can use air temperature to calculate the heat units to estimate when emergence is going to occur, but it can vary. So, question, Adam?
We do have a question.
All right, awesome.
Slightly off topic, but hey, let's stay true
to
our agronomist nature.
Generally, that means the topic sucks if we've got questions off topic coming in.
I don't think it's the topic sucks, but I think it's actually in regard to a previous Ask the Agronomist conversation.
All right.
So Tom had a question. He's wanting to know, first of all, he says, good morning. And he's you mentioned previously about using dicamba and Burndown.
Yes.
He's always hesitated a little bit in no-till and strip-till conditions because he's worried about the dicamba efficacy and losing a lot of dicamba by that landing on corn stalks and not being able to get to the ground.
The residual aspect of it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say, as a general rule, Doesn't matter whether it's dicamba, acetochlor, atrazine, pick your residual herbicide. It needs to be in the soil to be active. Now, dicamba is extremely water soluble, and it would be pretty easy to, probably wash the dicamba off the residue with a little bit of rain, get it into the soil, and still get some residual activity. Now, dicamba is so water soluble that it doesn't take very much rain for you to lose the residual control of dicamba. Dicamba has its most benefit as a residual in dry conditions. And that's where we see big benefits to including dicamba in not just a no-till burn down, but in a pre-emergent application on work ground. So most of my no-tillers, like to use dicamba in their burn down just because it's about the only thing that's going to kill mare's tail in the spring, and you want it for the weed control, but you get the added benefit of the residual control. The challenge we have is getting guys that are doing tillage to also include dicamba in their pre-plant residual application, because there are a lot of benefits as a residual. There's also benefits to control tillage escape weeds. If any of you have ever truly paid attention to how many weeds survive your soil finisher or your field cultivator, they're too numerous to count the weeds that survive your vertical till tool application, because that's, vertical till tools are more for residue management than they are weed control. So depending on what type of spring tillage you're doing, you might have some tillage escape weeds. That's another benefit of having dicamba in that pre-plant residual application. But back to Tom's question specifically, are you going to lose some of the residual benefit of any residual herbicide because of interference, tie up, or shielding of the soil by the residue that's there? I would say the short answer to that would be yes. The reality is there's still a benefit to using it, and the combination of the residual product and the residue is going to give you, good weed control. So we see less weed pressure typically in no-till systems. Some of that is because of the mulch of the residue that's there. Some of that is we're not stirring the soil up as much to stimulate germination of weeds. So there are differences from a weed control, weed pressure, weed science standpoint between no-till and conventional tillage. But I wouldn't let, and if you think about it, your question was specific to burn down. Well, regardless of when you're spraying your dicamba in a no-till system or whatever herbicide you're spraying in a no-till system, some of that herbicide is going to land on residue. It doesn't matter whether you're spraying it in March or April or May or June. There's residue there, especially in no-till soybeans. There's 2-year-old corn stalk residue, that you can still find. So there's a lot of residue in these systems. We still get very good weed control. So I wouldn't, let that, keep you from using it, but just keep in mind, you're going to get your best bang for your buck out of having dicamba in your pre-plant application when it's dry, because the other residual products you're using, be it a Valor or an Authority or a Sencor or an acetochlor or whatever residual, main residual you're using in your soybean program, needs a 1/2 inch or more of water to do anything for you. And if you get 2/10, 2/10, 2/10, 2/10, 2/10, that adds up to an inch, right? But it doesn't equal an inch worth of weed control because you never really got that herbicide truly activated quickly the way you want it to be. You want to have a 1/2 inch to a 3/4 inch good soak and rain to get, at a minimum, to get your base residual herbicides activated. And when we don't get that for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks after application, that's where you see a tremendous amount of value from having dicamba in that mix, because it will give you an unbelievable amount of, it's not considered to be a quote unquote strong residual, but in a drought, it is actually the strongest residual product we have out ahead of soybeans, because it's actually working where most residual products, when it's dry, aren't doing a damn thing until you get that activating rain. So any follow-up questions or anything there, Adam?
No,
Okay.
I think you covered it well, and there's no till and then strip till being in between. I think you're probably getting good coverage on your strip as well,
Right.
where you're tilling
Right.
and maybe invigorating some more
Yep.
germination weeds and all that.
Yep.
So yeah, I definitely think it's a great idea and a great recommendation.
I mean, there's a whole science to, herbicide efficacy, and, a lot of things that we do for convenience are not good for our herbicides. Planting after you've sprayed a no-till field isn't great for the herbicide. Row cleaners after you've sprayed a no-till field are not good for a herbicide. The best thing for the herbicide is to plant the field first and then lay the herbicide over the top. If you're doing tillage, tillage in some cases is not good for herbicides. If it never rains, incorporation from tillage is going to make your herbicide work better. If you get activating rainfall, activating rain is a better way to incorporate your herbicide than tillage. Especially with something like water hemp or grasses, which are small seeded weeds that germinate from the surface. Any herbicide that is deeper than where the seed is germinating from has relatively little impact on that weed unless it is a root absorbed product. Most of the good water hemp products are shoot absorbed products. And if you're, if here's your seed and here's the shoot coming up out of the seed, and here's your herbicide down here 2 inches underneath where the seed is, that's product that's pretty well wasted on at least on controlling that plant. So keeping more of your herbicide closer to the surface is generally best for controlling things like water hemp and grass, which are all germinating either at the surface or slightly below the surface. It's also what makes large seeded broadleaves that can come up from 2 or 3 inches deep, like giant ragweed, velvet leaf, cockleburr, things like that. Whole different ball game on how we control those weeds. They're bigger seed, they're tougher, they're germinating from deeper depths. They're just harder to control with residuals, and that's why most of those weeds cannot be effectively controlled without some sort of post-emergent application. So great question. Don't mind the digression at all for good questions. So back to my list of how we determine when to plant. There's like 15 of these things you can use to determine when to plant. So how about weather forecast? So weather forecast is something in recent years, especially, people worry about cold rains after planting. People worry about, what's the next 5 days going to be like after planting. So there's a school of thought out there that the conditions on the day you plant are almost irrelevant. I'll say almost, but the 5 days after you plant is probably more important than the day you planted. If the day you plant's perfect and the next week is horrible, that's going to turn out to be a bad day to plant. If the day you plant it was kind of shaky, but the next 7 days are beautiful, then you're going to get away with planting in less than ideal conditions. So the days following planting are pretty important. Calendar date's a big one. There are people that just feel that I need to plant in this window, and they're basing things on calendar date. The number of acres you've got to cover should be a factor as well. So if you've got 240 acres of corn to plant and 240 acres of beans to plant in your entire operation, and you can, in theory, plant your entire crop in 3 days, we don't need to be rushing it, if it's going to take 3 days to plant your crop. If you literally, honestly need 30 good days to get your crop planted, it's going to take more than 30 days on the calendar to get 30 good days of planting, right? Or if your operation's like me and you've got 2 planters, two 16-row planters, you've got the ability theoretically to plant 350 acres a day relatively easily, but one or both planters is always broke down, and you're lucky to get 20 acres done because of all the inefficiencies in your system. That's different. So, how much equipment do you have? How much labor do you have? How reliable is your labor? How reliable is your equipment? How many acres can you get done in a day? And how many acres do you have to do? It's fair to take all that into account and factor that into your decision of, well, how aggressive are you going to be pushing it? Peer pressure is a big one. We would all like to think we're not impacted by peer pressure, but you're lying if you say that's true. So you can get on TikTok, which I'm not a TikTok guy. I'd be in favor of banning TikTok myself. So not a fan of it. But if you want to be entertained, there's all sorts of funny making fun of farmers who, one day say they won't plant for 2 weeks, and the next day they're throwing the shed doors open because the neighbor's out in the field planting. So if you want to laugh at yourself, there's plenty of good things online that poke fun at how quickly we change our mind sometimes, and how little it takes to get us to change our mind. And then the last one I had on my list is, what crop are we talking about? So, are we thinking corn? Are we thinking beans? And that's a conversation I wanted to have, because I've had like 3 people call me in the last 48 hours that have a theory that it would be better to plant corn next week than beans. And the first time I heard it, I thought, well, that's a little odd. We've got this possible opportunity to get a bunch of April beans in, and we like these early planted beans, and everybody's been in on the early planted bean thing. And we've had challenges with corn planted early, crown rot, plant health. We've seen some really good May corn. So I was kind of confused, a little bit surprised where they were coming from on this, but their rationale was, well, if you look at the weather forecast, next week looks really nice. If you didn't just get 3 inches of rain because you were in the path of a tornado, you probably didn't get a lot of rain. There are places that actually have, through all this mess, have only had like 3/10. By Monday of next week, there's going to be places where it's probably pretty reasonably good planting conditions. Next week looks damn near perfect for planting. And if your soil is perfectly warm and perfectly dry, and you've got a good week, you might be able to get corn not only in, but up, in a fairly narrow window of time. And so that had people thinking, well, maybe I ought to give corn priority. And another thing that was factoring into people's thinking is some of the longer term forecasts make late April look kind of nasty. So if you're of the opinion that we've got a good week followed by nasty, do you want to rush around and get your corn in? Well, the challenge I posed to this individual was, well, if late April does truly turn out to be nasty, I think I'd rather have my corn in the bag, not in the field. And if late April's not nasty, well, why don't we just plant it then? So I didn't really get on board with this idea of let's go balls to the wall on corn next week because it's going to be really nice. To me, if you want to plant early, I still favor planting beans early. And granted, we often don't have conditions as perfect as next week sounds when we're planting early. And I think it's gotten ingrained in people that if we're going to plant early, we need to plant beans early because conditions are usually not very good early, and we're pushing it on conditions. And because conditions sound like they could be pretty ideal next week, that had some people thinking that, well, maybe I'd rather plant corn next week. I can't tell you which crop you ought to plant next week. I can't tell you if you should plant next week. I can't tell you if you can plant next week. And the piece of information we're missing to answer this question perfectly is none of us know the future. We don't know what's going to happen the rest of the growing season. We don't know what late April is going to be like. We don't even really know what next week is going to be like, let alone late April. We don't know what early May is going to be like. We don't know what's coming in the next 3 weeks if we pass up next week as an opportunity. And managing there's probably a good Donald Rumsfeld joke in here somewhere because we're dealing with the unknown unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen, and that makes it really difficult to predict what you ought to do. Most of you have enough work to do that we probably need to do something next week. I'm going to lean towards beans. Now, I have had it brought up to me. Well, now wait a minute. Well, what happens if I plant my April beans and they come up in 7 days because it's really nice, and then they get froze off? Oftentimes when we plant beans early, it takes them a month to come up, and they're a little bit protected from some of the late April freezes, which are pretty common. But, if you look at the forecast, there's a possibility that we're probably going to have a lot of these beans that are already planted are going to be up, next week. And the beans that go in the ground next week, might be up the week after that. And so are we going to have a lot of acres of beans that are susceptible to a late April freeze? Yes, we are. That's the fact. It doesn't necessarily mean that planting them was wrong. It doesn't mean that the late April freeze will ruin them, although it could. And that was another piece of logic that some of the let's plant corn next week camp was using as well. If we get a late April freeze, that's going to kill my early planted beans if they come up too fast. So I think I'd rather plant corn because corn can recover from a freeze. Well, it can, but it doesn't always. And even when it does recover from a freeze, it probably would have been better planted later and never going through the freeze. So once again, you can justify anything you want to do. You can rationalize anything you want to do. And that reminded my colleague Chris Carlisle of a funny story. He was talking to a farmer that he and I both know well. This was several years ago. This farmer's always been known for planting beans early. And Chris pretty well knew the guy had a lot of beans planted when he asked Chris this question. The question was, is it too early to plant beans? And Chris looked at him. He goes, well, don't you have a bunch of beans planted? And he goes, yeah, we're about half done. He said, then what difference does it make what I tell you? So in the end, most of you are going to do what you want, as you should. It's your farm. It's your operation. It's your butt that's on the line, not mine. So if you want our opinion, we'll give it to you. But in the end, you're probably going to generally do what you want. But I'm just kind of walking through some of the things that maybe you can think about to help you decide what you want to do. In the end, we don't know what the right thing to do is. Reality is most of us are going to take a month or so to get our crop in. You're not going to plant it all on the same day. If you can plant your whole crop on one day, well, then you need to pick a good one. But if you're like me and the first day you go to the field, you get 10 acres done. And the second day you go to the field, you get 40 acres done. And the third day you go to the field, you get 10 acres done again because you broke down again. And you get like one good day for every 5 days. Your planting gets spread out over several days. You don't do it all on the wrong day. There's always days every spring that looking back, I should have stayed in the house and done nothing that day. Would have been better than busting my butt to plant because it's a marginal stand or ended up replanting. So we always have our voodoo days. But anytime you try to second guess Mother Nature, typically she's going to juke you and you're going to end up with your shorts around your ankles and she's going to score because you just can't second guess Mother Nature. And that brings up another question that Adam got asked is, should we try to manipulate when plants emerge by varying our planting depth based on some of these unknown factors? That's one that kind of gets me fired up because that's really trying to that's not like second guessing Mother Nature. That's like fourth guessing Mother Nature, which is even more dangerous. So I'm not a fan of planting, early planted beans deeper to protect them from emerging too early and getting frozen off. I mean, the whole point of planting beans early is to get them to emerge early, get them to canopy early, get them to flower early. And if you're going to plant them deeper, you might as well have just planted them later because it's not when the bean gets planted that matters. It's when they canopy that matters. So I've always argued that if you plant beans April 1st and you plant beans May 1st, and they come up on the same day, now they rarely will. Almost always the April 1st beans will be up before the May 1st beans. But if they're truly not, if they truly do come up on the same day, they're going to yield the same. Matter of fact, the May beans will probably yield more than the April beans if they truly come up on the same day because the May 1st beans are probably going to have a more uniform stand. They're probably going to be less stressed. So it's not planting date that is magical about early planted beans. It's emergence date, canopy date, flowering date. That's what's magical about early planted soybeans. And the graph that's been behind me here since we started talking, we have people that act like this is not the response curve for planting date. We have people that act like That is the response curve for planting date, if you can see that. So if you can see this line, this would basically be representative of the earliest you can plant is the best, and then it gets worse every day after that. That's not the way that it works. Maybe within a narrow window, it looks that way. But if you look at long-term planting date studies that take planting from sometime in March till sometime after the middle of May, maybe to June, you get this kind of bell-shaped response curve where these, ultra early planted beans, I mean, when February 16th planted beans survive and make 85 bushel, that's really cool. That's very impressive. That's good to know. But they're not going to be your best beans. So ultra early is impressively cool that they survive, and they're generally good, even if you've got 2/3 of a stand. But they're not going to be as good as wherever the sweet spot is. And most of the data would say that the sweet spot is actually pretty large. And the sweet spot for soybeans is probably sometime mid to late April. Early May, still pretty good. Early April, still pretty good. The ultra early generally ends up being better than the traditional mid-May or especially late May. And the later you go, the faster that tail starts to drop off. But there is not a yield advantage to April 1st beans over April 20th beans very often. The advantage of the April 1st beans is you've got them done, and the earlier you start, the earlier you finish. So would you rather start earlier than optimum, or would you rather finish later than optimum? Realistically, you ain't getting it all done in the optimum. So you got to either start before optimum to finish before you get out of the optimum, or you start in the optimum and realize that you're going to finish after the optimum. It's 6 one way and half a dozen the other in a lot of cases. If we get into one of those years where, we lose the spring in early May and it's the middle of June before we can finish, well, those are the years that you should have been on the front side of optimum. If mid-May turns out to be perfect, like last year was in a lot of cases, you'd have been better off skipping this really early stuff and starting in the optimum and finishing after optimum. But this is back to that, there's too many variables that we don't know. And I was going to talk a little bit about variables. So when we do field research, Adam's done more of this than me when he worked for Dr. Velo. You have variables that you're trying to test. And in a very simple agronomic design, you've got one variable. And you're trying to isolate down to that one variable. In a planting date study, the variable you're isolating down to is planting date. So in a planting date study, you try to keep everything else constant, and the only thing you change is the planting date. In the real world, that's not the way that it happens, because in the real world, there's 100 interacting variables. And even sometimes in our research trials, we get interactions with variables that weren't supposed to be the variable that we were testing. So, variables can be soil type, drainage, variability in the field, weather, different fields. On farm, you're going to plant this field, April 10th, and you're going to plant this other field May 2nd, and then you're going to maybe compare those two fields. Well, yes, there's a difference in planting date there, but they might not be the same variety. They're definitely not the same field. They're not the same soil. Those fields don't have the same yield history. Those fields didn't get the same weather. There's too many differences for you to compare those fields. And so if the April 10th field yields more than the May whatever field, is that because of the planting date, or is that because of something else? And generally the way we look at things, if we believe in something, we're going to give that credit. If something happens that doesn't make sense to us, we're going to look for excuses to explain it. And if something happens that we don't believe, we're going to say, well, that study's no good. That's not the way that should have worked. And nothing works 100% of the time, but there are just too many variables in the real world for things to work out perfectly. And even in a research environment where we're trying to get down to just one thing that we're testing. So it might be nitrogen, it might be population, it might be planting date, it might be seed treatments, it might be fertility, it might be fungicide, it might, whatever the one thing is we really want to look at. You can design a study, and Adam's been involved with some of these that have 6 different variables, and it's a factorial study where you're looking at the interactions of different products. And you need to be a PhD university researcher with a whole bunch of hard workers like Adam working for you to do those type of trials. What we typically do in the field with growers is we're looking for one variable. But when you've got one variable you're trying to test, and you've got soil variability, moisture variability, water or weather variability, and all those other variables that interact with the one that we're trying to test, that's why you can't do anything one time and know the way it works. You got to do it 1,000 times and look for trends. And the trend with soybean planting date is this. It is a bell-shaped curve with a fairly broad top, and that broad top is where the highest yields typically come, and the broad top typically aligns with mid to late April. You can have situations where early April is better. You can even have situations where early May is better. I don't know that I've ever seen one where March was better, but March can be damn good. There's been plenty of studies where March planted soybeans have made 90 bushel. But if March planted soybeans in a study made 90 bushel, typically some planting date in April probably made 100. So, is 90 and 100 both good? Hell yes. I'd like to raise either one of them. But you can't necessarily say that there's a lot of data to support that March beans are going to out yield April beans, or early April beans are going to out yield late April beans. And there's even less data to support that anything earlier than April 20th is going to benefit corn. So any questions coming in while I'm ranting and raving there?
No questions. I would just, back to your one variable or multiple variables, I always like to give the advice to growers that I'm always encouraging them to try new things, but yes. I also like to remind them that you got to be careful when you're trying new things, depending on how you set up the thing that you're trying.
Right.
And just because you think it worked that one time, I would tell you it's not necessarily something you need to adopt on every acre.
Right.
And just the opposite, that just because it didn't work that one time doesn't mean that it shouldn't be adopted or continually looked at, depending on how you set it up. And because it's such a limited view.
Right. Well, fungicide's a good example of that. I mean, how many of you have done a fungicide comparison, which they're not easy, right? Especially if you're area applying fungicides. If you're using a ground rig, it's a little easier. But if you took the time to do a fungicide side by side in corn, let's say, and you had a 20 bushel positive response, that's probably the last time you took the time to do that. And you've been putting fungicide on every acre of your corn ever since you did that. You are I'm all in on fungicide. I am too. I would say you're right to think that. But the 20 bushel difference you saw is not normal. That's a larger than normal response to fungicide. The flip side, let's say you did it, you went to all that work, it was 3 bushel better, or heaven forbid, it was 5 bushel worse. What are you going to think? You're going to think, well, those damn guys, they're just selling me that. I knew that wouldn't pay. I'm not doing that again. My corn's going to be wetter, didn't yield more. It's just, guys using fungicide are dumb. I'm not going to do that. That's not the right, conclusion either. Reality is somewhere in between. And when you look at any set of data, you got data on this end, which is hugely positive, and then you got data on this end, which is probably negative. Any set of data you look at is going to have the tails where you're seeing huge responses or maybe no response, and generally the tails are probably locations that maybe we were measuring something that had nothing to do with the variable we intended to measure. So if your fungicide treated was in a better part of the field than your fungicide untreated, you might have got a 40 bushel yield difference. Well, maybe that was 10 bushel worth of fungicide and 30 bushel worth of something else that just gets lumped into a 40 bushel fungicide response. Okay, let's talk cover crops for a minute. So cover crops are greening up nicely. They are going to take off and grow like crazy next week with some moisture and some warm weather. And so, it's time to start thinking about, probably past time to start thinking about when you're going to take those cover crops out, how you're going to take those cover crops out. So deciding when to terminate a cover crop is a pretty important piece of the system. And depending on what crop you're planting, so are you going to corn, are you going to beans, that's going to influence when the proper timing to take out that cover crop is. The species of the cover crop is going to determine what the proper timing is. Maybe you chose to plant something like oats and turnips that don't need to be terminated because they're killed by the winter. So your cover crop has been terminated by Mother Nature. You don't have to worry about that. That is a safer approach, especially ahead of corn, than planting something like cereal rye, which needs to be taken out very timely ahead of corn. Soybeans are a lot more forgiving to, being planted into big cereal rye. There's a camp out there that likes to plant green into, waist high, shoulder high cereal rye and then take it out after planting. The organic growers can use rollers and crimpers. If you let it get big enough, you can just break it over and do a pretty good job taking it out, and then let that thick mat lay there and suppress a lot of weeds for you if you're in a system where you can't use herbicides. So it really depends on what you're trying to do with that cover crop. When you should take it out, but just be aware that if it gets ahead of you and it gets too big, they're going to get harder to control. You get into more herbicide negative interactions. So sometimes, and I do this on my own farm, I oftentimes will make a separate pass with nothing but Roundup, AMS, and water to take out my rye. And I don't try to control it with tank mixing in with my residual chemistry, because that residual chemistry can be very antagonistic to trying to control the rye. You can offset that with rate to a certain extent. Depends on your own personal philosophy. Is it worth that extra pass? I personally would prefer to take out the cover crop early, plant the beans, and then lay my residual on over the top. Versus, and let's go back to Tom's question about spraying. If you're worried about spraying dicamba on dead crop residue, well, what's happening to my residual herbicide when I'm spraying it on 2 foot tall rye? That's not a great scenario for that residual product. Now you're going to get a lot of weed control out of the 2 foot tall rye. And I do know some producers that are trying to use rye as their residual and taking the residuals completely out of the program. That makes me a little nervous from a weed management standpoint. You can get a lot of weed control from that rye, but it's probably not going to be to the same level of weed control that you're going to get from herbicide. Now the weed resistance management folks, think we've kind of missed an opportunity to talk about how beneficial cover crops can be for weed resistance management. Because if your cover crop is controlling 85% of your weeds, that means you're only putting selection pressure with whatever herbicide you're using on 15% of the weed population, which is going to develop resistance a lot more slowly than putting selection pressure on 100% of your weed population, which is what you're doing if you're relying strictly on herbicides. So that's a little more of a theoretical benefit to cover crops and weed resistance management. It's a little hard to figure out, okay, how is that putting money in my pocket? But it could provide benefits down the road as far as slowing the development of resistant weeds if we were utilizing cover crops in the system. So if you've got cover crops out there, just be aware that, when you're going to take those out, how you're going to take those out, what are you going to use to take those out. There are people that really get into the science of managing soil moisture by either taking the cover crop out early or letting it grow. So this is a little bit of a little bit different than the way most people think. I think a lot of people think that bare ground dries out faster than ground that's growing cover crop. And it's true, you get more evaporation of moisture off the surface on bare ground. But if you've got a live growing crop on the ground, you're pumping a lot of water out through that plant that's growing there. And there are actually people that try to manage cover crops so intensively that if it's going to be a dry spring or if it's dry conditions, they want to take that cover crop out early because they don't want it wasting their water. We here in central Illinois typically deal with excess soil moisture a lot more often in the spring than we deal with lack of soil moisture. So for us, there could be situations where you want that cover crop wasting water because you've got more water than you know what to do with. And if you let it get a little bigger, let it go a little longer, it's going to pull a lot of water out of that soil profile. And there could be benefits of letting it get a little bigger. I have an example of that working in the real world. We used to bale hay on a field that was actually a pasture but didn't have fence on it anymore. So we just took hay off of it, and it had a really flat, wet, swampy area next to a creek that basically all that would grow there was reed canary grass. Reed canary grass thrives in swamp conditions, and in a dry spring, we were able to get through there and mow that. And I'm not sure why we tried so hard to mow it and bale it, because even if you could get it in a bale and get it dry enough to keep it from spoiling in the bale, cows don't really like to eat reed canary grass. So unless they're starving, they're not going to eat a bale of reed canary grass. But anyway, I'm a tight ass farmer, so that's why I was trying to get it baled. But what would often happen, when it was dry enough you could mow it, you're thinking, okay, great, we're going to get this baled. Well, 3 days later, when you came back to rake it, water standing everywhere. It didn't rain. It'd been 80 degrees and sunny. Grass, the other stuff we mowed was just perfect, ready to rake, dry conditions. And you can't even drive through this area of this field anymore, let alone rake it up and get it baled dry. Well, why is that? Well, when I cut that 5-foot tall reed canary grass off and that plant quit using water, the soil profile just, got resaturated because we weren't utilizing that water. Cover crops will do the same thing. I've had situations where guys have split fields with cereal rye, and they've noticed at planting time when it's wet, the side of the field that's got rye on it is actually drier than the side of the field that didn't have rye on it. People think that mat of vegetation that the cover crop creates is going to make the field wetter. It might make the surface wetter, but the whole soil profile is probably actually going to be drier because that cover crop is utilizing some of that excess moisture. Adam, you'd had a question, I think, from a grower about is it okay to plant first and then spray right behind the planter? Is that right?
Yeah.
Get that right?
Yep.
So I was actually involved in some research we did many moon ago, looking at no-till. This is when no-till drills were fairly early and no-till soybeans was a thing. We actually, for plot purposes, mounted spray booms on the front of a Coulter type drill. This would have been before the John Deere 750, back when it was Great Plains and Tie that ruled the no-till world. So we've got a spray boom mounted in front of the Coulters on a no-till drill. And then we did another setup where we mounted it behind the harrow on a no-till drill. So we're literally spraying Burndown as we no-till drill soybeans, just to see how that would compare to spraying a day or two before we planted the field. And the ranking would be, so before, planting was best. Behind the drill was worst, and in front of the drill was in the middle. And I'm going to make up some numbers here, but this would be close. So if we say this was 100% control, and we'll say this was 85, and we'll say this was 90. So both of these methods killed a lot of weeds. The weeds that they didn't kill were, when you're spraying in front, if you spray that weed and then you slice it off with the drill, you didn't give time for that herbicide to translocate into the root, and then that plant's just going to regrow. Behind the drill, you have the same problem as in front of the drill if you cut off the top of the plant, but you also have the added problem of you've covered some up with dirt, you've gotten them all dirty, you're getting, damage on those plants. And in addition to being damaged, they're also covered with dirt and dust, and that can interfere with herbicide uptake as well. So that was generally the ranking. How far before? It can be just a matter of hours, even 3 or 4 hours before you go out there with the drill, especially with a product like glyphosate that gets in the plant very quickly and moves very quickly. You don't have to kill the plant. Well, actually, you do need to kill the plant, but it doesn't need to look like it's been killed. If you give that herbicide just time to get in the plant and move in the plant before you cover it up with dirt or cut it off, it's going to be a dead plant. But if you haven't given it time to get the herbicide in, or if the herbicide couldn't get in because it got tied up by dust and dirt that was covering the weed, or maybe it got in, but right after it got in, you cut the plant off, then it couldn't translocate. You're not going to get complete control of that weed. So the answer to, Adam's grower's question was, yes, you can do it that way. And if you're using the right program and your weed pressure is not too heavy, and depending on what your weed spectrum is, you may get a satisfactory burn down, but it's probably not going to be as good as if you had sprayed that field, let's say 6 hours before you planted versus right after you planted. Okay, I'm going to look at my notes here to see what else I'm forgetting. Okay, so Adam, you had a bunch of those questions that growers have been asking you. I know we had touched on a few of them through the conversation here, but you had asked about seeding rates was another question that you'd been asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd been asked about seeding rates in regard to a couple different things. One was calendar date, and the other was field conditions, as far as good or bad field conditions in response to the population.
Yeah. So Adam's questions were, and we'll look at both crops. So calendar date wise, with soybeans, it's kind of the opposite of what you would think. So we'll make some assumptions here. And they say you can't make assumptions, but to answer a question, you have to establish some assumptions. And then we get into the, well, it depends part, because you can't guarantee that the assumptions you make are going to hold true. So let's assume you plant beans April 1st versus May 1st versus June 1st. And let's assume they all come up the same percentage of seeds that you plant. I would say the April 1st bean should be the thinnest, the May 1st should be in the middle, and the June 1st should be the thickest, just as a general rule. So as you plant beans earlier, you're typically going to get more vegetative growth. You're going to have more time for vegetative and reproductive growth, and those beans are going to tend to be bigger and have more nodes, and so you can have fewer plants and achieve the same yield. Now, if you want to make the assumption, but I'm only going to get half of what I plant to come up, April 1st, versus they're all going to come up what I plant June 1st, well, then I want to increase my seeding rate on my early planted beans. It may happen that way. You may prevent yourself from replanting by increasing your seeding rate, but I'm going to tell you not to do it, because generally you're not going to save yourself from a replant situation by overplanting your beans. So we talked about a freeze. Jack Frost, don't care whether you got 60,000 beans out there or 160,000 beans out there. If it gets down to 27 degrees for more than about an hour, beans are dead. And you can frost off 160,000 beans just as easy as you can frost off 60,000 beans. The other thing I typically see is if you don't get a stand because you've got wet, saturated, soggy soils, you can suffocate 160,000 seeds as easy as you can suffocate 110,000 seeds. Let's say you get soil crusting. Well, if you get soil crusting, the only beans that are going to make it up are the ones that make it up through a crack somewhere. And yes, if you plant more, you're going to get more. But what I remind growers is let's say you were going to plant 120,000. And let's say conditions are not perfect. So you say, I'm going to bump it to 150. So I'm going to invest another 30,000 seeds worth of insurance in making sure that I get a stand. And then let's say we get 50% emergence. And you're going to get 50% of both of these numbers. So this becomes a final stand of 60,000. This becomes a final stand of 75,000. Now, I'll tell you honestly, you could leave either one of those and it would be fine. But are you going to be willing to leave either one of those? And I would say most growers would not be satisfied with leaving either one of those. So the extra 15,000 plants you got by spending an extra 30,000 plants worth of seed didn't do you a damn bit of good because you end up replanting both of them anyway. Now, if you can honestly tell me, Lance, I'd love 75,000, but I wouldn't leave 60. Well, then this strategy helped you. But most people who would not leave 60 will not leave 75 either. So what would it take for you to leave it? You know, let's say, well, I'd be satisfied with, I was going to plant 120. And planting 120, that means I want 100. So if it takes 100 to get you to leave it alone, that means you have to plant 200. And while that would be very helpful to Adam getting his daughters through college someday, that's a lot of money. You're not going to want to plant 200,000 seeds with today's seed costs. And heaven forbid, what happens if 195,000 of them come up? You don't want that either. So I do not really ever recommend increasing seeding rates in soybeans to compensate for anything other than calendar date. And calendar date is real. But here's the other mistake I think people make. And this is being driven by, Adam, is May 10th late to plant soybeans?
Is it late?
Yeah.
No,
it's not really late, right? But when somebody started March 25th, does May 10th feel late? Yes, it does. It does. They're like, holy cow, guys, been planting beans for 6 weeks. I'm so far behind. I'm the worst farmer in the world. And I've heard late planted soybeans, you got to increase the seeding rate. Well, you do, but May 10th is not late. So I'm going to say about June 10th-ish. At least wait till June. June 5th is kind of a common date some people use. I'm more, June 10th or after. So it's got to be pretty damn late before I say you really need to start bumping your seeding rates on soybeans. So we don't need to be talking about increasing seeding rates in soybeans because of planting date for several more, ask the agronomist. But we will get to a point where, yes, beans are going to be shorter. They're going to have fewer main stem nodes. You're not going to get near as much vegetative growth, and we need more plants to maximize yield. But that's really late. Corn, same thing, really. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're tempted to increase your corn seeding rate because soil conditions or weather conditions are so bad you think you're going to get a crappy stand, I'd really ask you to consider why you're planting. So I would rather wait if that's the scenario I find myself in than plant extra, because corn especially. I mean, it's never a good day if you're losing 10 or 20 or 30% of your corn stand, and just increasing your seeding rate to compensate for that is not really a good place to be in. So as a general rule, my short answer to his question would be no. Don't be monkeying with your seeding rate because of planting date or soil conditions.
Well, the other thing too, Lance, with both corn and soybeans, back to your example of overplanting to try to achieve a stand on beans, right? Or even with corn, the likelihood that you're going to have even distribution
right
of that reduced stand,
right, is zero.
Not going to happen.
Right.
So it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So I two kind of rules govern my attitude on this. A lot of fields of beans get replanted every year that didn't have to be. And a lot of fields of beans are being overplanted because someone thinks that is giving them added protection against needing to replant. And I think both of those things are mistakes. I think you're better off to plant the proper rate. And we can argue what the proper rate is, and we can agree to disagree on that. If your proper rate's 160, that's fine. If your neighbor's proper rate's 100, that's fine. I would say the data is pretty clear that at 70,000 plus on most soil types and most situations, assuming they're relatively uniform and assuming you can keep them clean, that's going to maximize your yield. There have been population studies where we've gone below 40,000 on soybean stands, and the yield loss is, while there is a yield loss, it's surprisingly low. You actually have additional harvest loss then because they are branched so low that your cutter bar is going through pods and the beans are just flying everywhere. And sometimes you go over the top of a branch that's got 15 beautiful pods on it because the branch was basically at the soil surface and the cutter bar just slides over the top of it. So a couple researchers that I know, they actually question whether there is any true yield reduction from ultra low soybean populations. They just think they're getting increased harvest loss, and that's why they're yielding less. They actually think the yield is there. You just can't get it all in the combine. But it's we don't have to try to convince you to accept a final stand of 50,000. In most cases, I would say, yeah, we need to thicken that up. But there's a lot of fields that are probably in that 70, 80, 90,000 final stand level that get replanted that probably didn't need to be.
So real quick, I know we're up against time here, Lance, but I know we're talking about seeding rates. What about seeding depth? We gotta have a quick conversation on seeding depth.
Yep. So we'll draw a picture here. So if here's your soil, so we'll do corn first. Corn's a little easier conversation to have. So here's your seed. There's your radical root. There's your mesocollar coming up. There's a reason why we want this to be about 2 inches. So your crown roots are going to set typically halfway between the soil surface and the seed, assuming your planting depth is in that 1.5 to 2.5 inch depth. The crown wants to set 1 inch roughly above the seed, and it's going to do that because that's what it wants to do. If you plant your seed 1 inch deep, that's going to force that crown to set pretty close to the soil surface. And that's when we get into rootless corn. You cannot grow corn roots. There's 3 things that you can't grow corn roots into. You can't grow them into concrete, you can't grow them into air, and you can't grow them into water. So you've got to have moisture, and you got to have soil you got to have soil contact, and you got to have soil that's not so hard that the roots can penetrate the soil. And the closer that crown gets to the surface, the higher the likelihood is that it's going to be in an environment that roots won't grow in. And you don't want to be trying to set your crown roots in an environment where roots can't grow. And the best environment for roots to grow, is typically about that 1 inch depth. So that's why we preach, 2 inches ish for corn planting depth. Now, if you get some at 1.5 inches, that's okay. If you occasionally got one at 2.5 inches, that's okay. Now, if your seeding depth is varying 1 inch across the field, we probably need to talk about some planter settings and maybe some speed, and that's not good. But somewhere between 1.5 inches and 2.5 inches deep is a good planting depth for corn. And I would say, if you're dry as a bone down 2 inches deep and you've got moisture at 3 inches, it's okay to go deeper, to go after moisture if you want to, or you can wait till you get some moisture and plant it at an appropriate depth. I'm not a shallow planted guy. Now, every time somebody plants shallow and it's good moisture and that crop is up 5 days faster, it looks beautiful. And I'm not saying that you can't raise some good corn when you plant shallower than I say you should, but year in and year out, I see far more emergence problems in corn from seeds that were too shallow versus seeds that were too deep. I think we're always worried about being too deep. So people are erring on the side of, I don't want to be too deep. And if you got in the back of your mind, I don't want to be too deep, you're more likely going to end up shallow rather than deep. So not often do I walk out in the field and start digging and go, holy cow, this guy buried this corn. That doesn't happen very often. Soybeans, I probably plant beans deeper than some people do. I'm kind of in that 1.5-inch-ish depth on soybean seeding. I would say somewhere, inch to 1.5 inches on soybeans. Soybeans develop as a seedling differently than corn does. Cotyledons are going to come above the soil. Soybeans are a taproot system, develop totally differently. But I don't really like, there are situations where when we're planting early, got lots of residue, got lots of moisture. Guys like, hey, I just got to get them covered. I just want to get them covered. They're going to come up faster, but that's not necessarily an ideal situation either. I have seen more herbicide interaction sometimes we worry about soybean hypocotyls getting exposed to herbicide, absorbing a lot of herbicide. We don't really want your soybean herbicides right there in your seed, your root zone either. And I've seen some situations where I think plants got even more stressed because they're just, they're just hanging out right in that top inch of soil that's the hot zone from a herbicide standpoint. And if that seed would have been a little deeper, I think they would have been a little less exposed to some of that. So you can find situations where this guy planted shallow and he got a stand. This guy planted at the proper depth and he didn't get a stand. And every time somebody sees that, they remember that forever. And like, okay, well, that guy looks smart because he planted shallow. So these guys are telling me not to shallow up. Well, that was wrong in this case. Well, nobody pays attention to the 15 times it was right. They focus on the one time it was wrong. And that makes you tempted to plant shallow thinking that's going to help you. I firmly believe that the odds are shallow planting will hurt you more often than it helps you. And I know some of you are out there screaming at the top of your lungs and I'm full of crap, and you plant corn 1.25 inches deep every year, and that's why you raise the best corn in the county. I would say that is not why you raise the best corn in the county. There's something else you're doing that is why you raise the best corn in the county, not the fact that it was planted 1.25 inches deep.
All right. No more questions at this time.
Okay. All right. So what's our next date, Adam?
We are back on the 20th.
Okay, so back on April 20th. Is that Earth Day? I think that's usually about when Earth Day is. Oh. So we'll be back on April 20th. So hopefully I'm all by my lonesome on April 20th because you're all out planting what will end up being your highest yielding crop on April 20th, 2 weeks from today. Thank you for your questions, and always enjoy being here with you on Ask the Agronomist. And we will be back in 2 weeks. And remember, about a week-ish from today will be when we drop the interview with myself and Nick Weber. He is far more entertaining than I am, so that'll be, I think, a fun episode for you to watch. So some rainy day morning, or when you're waiting for somebody to fix your planter tractor or your planter, or you're waiting for that next load of seed to get to the farm, you can check out and ask the Agronomist Asks video series. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks, Adam, for your help this morning. Thank you all for being here. Everybody stay safe, and thoughts and prayers going out to those of you that are trying to recover from storm damage. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Take care.